The stench was the first thing. A thick, sickly sweet, putrid odor that clung to the cold damp air of 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, North London. It was February 1983, and the residents of the top-floor flat were complaining bitterly about the persistently blocked drains. The landlord, exasperated, called in a plumber named Michael Catron. What Catron found when he lifted the manhole cover was not the usual tangle of fat and debris, but something far more sinister. Floating in the murky water were fragments of bone, and what looked unmistakably like human flesh. He would later recall the sight of small, pinkish-white pieces, almost like chicken, but with a horrifying, unnatural texture. This was the moment the reign of one of Britain's most prolific and chilling serial killers began to unravel, all because of a simple, clogged drain. The final victim, a young man named Stephen Neil Sinclair, had finally found a way to speak from beyond the grave, his remains acting as the grim, silent witness that would bring the Muswell Hill murderer to justice. Before we continue with the chilling details of this case, please take a moment to comment, like, share, and subscribe to the Calendar of Crime. Your support helps us bring these important, often forgotten stories to light, ensuring you don't miss any future episodes. Now let's return to the tragic life and death of Stephen Neil Sinclair. Stephen Neil Sinclair was a young man adrift in the unforgiving sprawl of 1980s London. Born in Perth, Scotland, in 1962, he was just 20 years old when his life was brutally cut short. Like so many of Dennis Nilsen's victims, Stephen was vulnerable, a drifter who had fallen into the perilous world of drug addiction and homelessness. He was a familiar, yet often overlooked, figure in the vibrant but dangerous Soho area, a place where the bright lights of the city masked a deep, desperate underbelly. Stephen's life was a constant struggle for warmth, food, and a temporary escape from the harsh reality of the streets. He was searching for connection, for a moment of kindness, or perhaps just a place to rest his head for the night. This vulnerability was precisely what the predator sought, a beacon in the dark that drew the killer's attention. Stephen was not a statistic. He was a son. A person with a past and a future that was stolen from him by a man who saw him not as a human being, but as an object for his darkest desires. His story is a poignant reminder of the forgotten victims of serial killers, those whose lives were already marginalized before they met their tragic end. The man who would end Stephen's life was Dennis Andrew Nilsen, a seemingly unremarkable civil servant with a terrifying secret. Nilsen had been operating undetected for 5 years, beginning his reign of terror in 1978 at his first address, 195 Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood. His modus operandi was chillingly consistent. He would frequent pubs in the Soho area, targeting young, often homosexual, men who were down on their luck, offering them food, drink, and a place to stay. Once they were back at his flat, and often intoxicated or asleep, he would carry out his horrific acts, typically strangling them with a ligature. The sheer volume of his crimes was staggering. He confessed to murdering between 12 and 15 young men during this period. At Melrose Avenue, he initially disposed of the bodies by burning them in bonfires in his garden, a method that, astonishingly, went unnoticed by his neighbors. When he moved to the top-floor flat at 23 Cranley Gardens in late 1981, his disposal methods had to change, leading him to the fatal decision that would ultimately be his undoing. The new flat, with its shared drains and closer proximity to other residents, was a ticking time bomb for a man with such a monstrous secret. The night of January 26, 1983, was Stephen Neil Sinclair's last. He was in the Golden Lion pub in Soho, a place Nilsen knew well as a hunting ground. Nilsen approached Stephen, offering him the familiar lure of a hot meal and a warm place to sleep, a proposition that must have sounded like salvation to the cold, exhausted 20-year-old. Stephen, under the influence of drugs and alcohol, accepted the offer, and the two men made their way back to Cranley Gardens. Once inside the flat, the facade of hospitality quickly dissolved. Stephen, worn out and intoxicated, soon fell into a deep sleep. Nilsen stood over him, the familiar dark compulsion taking hold. He later recounted the chilling words he spoke to the unconscious young man. "Oh, Stephen, here I go again." It was a moment of cold, self-aware horror, a final, perverse acknowledgement of the evil he was about to commit. Nilsen used a ligature, a tie and a piece of rope to strangle Stephen, ending his life in the most brutal and intimate way. What followed the murder was a grotesque ritual that defined Nilsen's necrophilia. After the life had left Stephen's body, Nilsen carried out his usual routine. He bathed the corpse, carefully washing and drying it. He then dressed the body and laid it on his bed, treating it with a bizarre, twisted reverence. He applied talcum powder to the skin and arranged 3 mirrors around the bed, creating a macabre tableau. Nilsen would then strip naked and lie down next to the body, kissing it goodnight before falling asleep. This ritualistic behavior was a central, horrifying part of his crimes, a desperate attempt to keep his victims with him, to control and possess them even in death. The next day, the practical problem of disposal began. Nilsen dismembered Stephen's body, storing the parts in various locations around the flat. He then attempted to dispose of the flesh, internal organs, and smaller bones of Stephen and 2 other victims he had killed at Cranley Gardens by flushing them down the toilet. This was the critical error. The small, narrow drains of the Victorian house were simply not designed to handle the gruesome load, and the system quickly became clogged. The blocked drains were a problem Nilsen could not solve. On February 4, 1983, he made the astonishing decision to write a letter of complaint to his estate agent about the blockage. The plumber Michael Catrin arrived and made his grim discovery. When he mentioned the strange, fleshy remains, Nilsen, with unnerving composure, suggested it was someone flushing down their Kentucky Fried Chicken. The police were called, and Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. and his team arrived at Cranley Gardens. The smell was overwhelming, a powerful, unmistakable stench of decay. When questioned, Nilsen initially played the shocked resident. But the act quickly crumbled. DCIJ, a seasoned officer, pressed him, asking where the rest of the body was. Nilsen's reply was delivered with a chilling, matter-of-fact calmness that would forever haunt the officers involved. In the cupboard. It was a moment of profound, sickening realization. Nilsen then began to confess, not just to Stephen's murder, but to a litany of killings stretching back 5 years, calmly detailing his horrific acts to a stunned police force. The trial of Dennis Nilsen in October 1983 was a sensation, a horrifying glimpse into the mind of a man who had lived a double life as a civil servant and a serial killer. He was found guilty on 6 counts of murder and 1 of attempted murder, and sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison. He died in prison in 2018, taking the full truth of his crimes and the names of many of his victims with him. But the story of Stephen Neil Sinclair remains the most crucial, for it was his death, and the subsequent, desperate attempt to dispose of his remains, that finally brought Nilsen's reign of terror to an end. Stephen's tragic life and death serve as a stark, powerful reminder of the hidden dangers lurking in the shadows of the city, and the quiet, often forgotten lives that are lost to such monstrous acts. Remember to comment, like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes of the Calendar of Crime.